time for Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla. Stay tuned for insights, impact, and inspiration right here on Channel Africa. Available on the Channel Africa app.
And it's a very good evening to you. A warm welcome. This is Africa World Hour right here on Channel Africa, the African perspective. Stay connected to Africa and the world with Channel Africa, the international voice of the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And just a reminder that you can watch us anytime, anywhere by simply going to your Play Store or App Store and downloading the Channel Africa app. We are also on Audio Bouquet Channel 802 on DSTV. You'll also find us on OpenView Channel. Listen to us and watch us on Facebook and YouTube. And you can also speak to us on the various social media platforms. Welcome to it. I am Tsepiso Makwetla. Let's go straight to your top stories this hour.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And we start with this. Zimbabwe says more than 15 of its citizens have been killed while fighting in the Russian war on Ukraine. The government says more than 60 Zimbabwean nationals are still trapped on the front lines. The BBC's Shingai Nyoka reports.
The Zimbabwe government admitting for the first time that dozens of its nationals are in military service to Russia. It believes they were deceived by trafficking networks into enlisting. 15 Zimbabweans are confirmed dead. Over 60 others are still trapped on the front lines, authorities said. Harare is in talks with Moscow to repatriate the remains of those who have died and to ensure the safe return of the others. A spokesman said the government is also working to dismantle the trafficking networks responsible for the recruitments.
The African Union has thrown its weight behind the adoption by the UN General Assembly resolution led by Ghana, which recognizes the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity. The continental body has commended President John Mahama for his leadership. Kailihle Kumalo reports.
The African Union Commission Chief Mahmoud Ali Yusuf says this reflects Africa's long-standing and principled call for the full recognition of the slave trade and its enduring consequences. He says this also marks an important step towards truth, justice, healing, and reinforces the urgent need to address the legacy of slavery. The continental body has further called for comprehensive acknowledgement of the historical and contemporary impact of slavery, including the pursuits of reparative justice.
Nicolas Maduro and former First Lady Celia Flores will make a second U.S. court appearance later today in Manhattan, New York, with lawyers for the deposed president of Venezuela expected to push for the dismissal of all charges. Maduro and Flores were captured in an U.S. military operation in Caracas in January and then brought to the United States to face narco-trafficking, narco-terrorism and weapons charges, allegations to which they both pleaded not guilty to, while Maduro declared himself a prisoner of war. Sharon Bryce Peace reports.
Maduro and Flores have been detained in separate cells at the Brooklyn Metropolitan Detention Center since their capture in early January and 11 weeks since their first court appearance on January 5th. Both accused have been embroiled in a dispute over U.S. sanctions that prevent the Venezuelan government from paying for the couple's legal defense, an issue likely to feature in court proceedings, while arguments for the entire case to be thrown out are also expected to feature. Prosecutors argue that because the U.S. had not formally recognized Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president since 2019, he and Flores should not expect the U.S. government to allow the Venezuelan government to pay their legal costs.
Israel says it has killed the commander of the Navy of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz says Alireza Tangsiri was killed in an explosion along with other senior Navy officials. Katz says Tangsiri was directly responsible for the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz. The BBC's Frank Gardner reports from the Qatari capital Doha.
This side of the Gulf, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are getting hit every night with drones and missiles, most of which are intercepted, some of which get through, causing damage. Qatar has been spared for the last week, but my God, it took a hit about a week ago. The hit on the Ras Laffan gas processing plant, 50 miles, 80k up the coast from here, is the worst hit on any critical national infrastructure in this entire region. It's knocked out 17% of its capacity for 5 years.
And finally, a commission set up to investigate violence during the anti-corruption protests in Nepal last September has recommended that the former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli be prosecuted for failing to prevent dozens of deaths. The findings were leaked just hours before newly elected members of parliament were sworn in. The BBC's Joanna Keane reports.
KP Sharma Oli and his government were forced to resign amid demonstrations which began over a brief social media ban, but were fuelled by anger over corruption and social inequality. At least 19 young people were killed as police opened fire on protesters on the first day. 77 people died during 2 days of unrest that saw government buildings and the Supreme Court set on fire. Mr. Oli maintains he never ordered security forces to shoot, but the commission found there was no effort to stop or control the firing.
Ritmos e cultura. Hoje vamos celebrar um momento muito especial na música, em particular o universo do jazz moçambicano. Ladies and gentlemen, senhoras e senhores, temos o privilégio de receber um dos maiores nomes do jazz de África, moçambicano e, por que não, o mundo lusófono, Moreira Chunguissa, para falarmos sobre o lançamento da edição especial em vinil do seu icônico álbum The Journey, The Moreira Project, Volume 1.
A música é que me escolheu e não foi eu que escolhi a música. O saxofone é que me escolheu, não fui eu que escolhi o saxofone. Eu sinto-me honrado, sinto-me de alguma maneira satisfeito e, mais importante, sinto-me feliz porque usamos o álbum The Journey como um influenciador, catalisador e eu sinto-me honrado.
Ritmos e cultura com Jacob Tivani, todos os domingos das 20 às 21 horas.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
At 9:07, you are listening to Africa World Hour. Uganda's economy is showing renewed momentum with strong consumer demand and increased activity in key sectors like construction driving growth. According to the Finance Ministry, Uganda recorded an 8.5% expansion in the financial quarter ending December 2025, up significantly from 5.4% during the same period a year earlier. Channel Africa's economics reporter Innocent Samosa has more.
In a post on social media, the Finance Minister of Uganda attributed the strong end-of-year performance to a combination of factors, highlighting robust consumer demand and increased activity across key sectors, including construction, as major drivers of the country's economic growth. Economist John Walungembe says while this is encouraging, the current global economic uncertainty might reverse the gains.
The economy as a whole is projected to grow by around above 6%. However, due to the current constraints in the global energy markets, this growth projection might not be realized, in my opinion. In this particular quarter, industry grew by 12.2%. Construction outperformed other sectors because it grew by 19.4%. But also agriculture saw an increase in performance by 8.8%. In terms of construction, the construction work around the East African crude pipeline, as well as pre-election spending, could have contributed to this surge as well.
The near completion of the $5 billion oil pipeline is expected to boost revenues significantly. The question remains, what risks and opportunities does this present for Uganda's long-term economic stability and diversification?
On the issue of the 80% completion of the East African oil pipeline. I would say that there are many opportunities. Of course, in the short term, we've seen opportunities in the construction phase, but also in terms of revenues. Uganda will enjoy increased revenues as due to the sales, and if the prices of oil and gas remain, then it can be a win for the country. More so if we swiftly commence the production phase of this whole activity.
While Uganda's strong growth signals a resilient economic outlook, experts caution that sustaining this momentum will depend on how the country navigates global uncertainties and leverage major investments like its oil infrastructure. The focus now shifts to whether this growth can translate into long-term stability and inclusive development. For Channel Africa News, I'm Innocent Samosa in Johannesburg, South Africa.
And we go to this reports that South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has been uninvited from the upcoming G7 summit in Evian-le-Bain, France, scheduled for June 2026. The South African presidency has reportedly pointed to sustained pressure from the United States President Donald Trump, with some sources even suggesting that Washington threatened a full boycott of the summit if South Africa was permitted to attend. This latest snub follows a series of escalating tensions between Pretoria and the Trump administration over issues ranging from South Africa's foreign policy stances to domestic land reform narratives. To help make sense of the continuation of hostilities for South Africa's global standing and, of course, our crucial trade relations, we're joined now by senior political economist at the Trade Collective, Dr. Lebohang Pheko. A very good evening to you, Dr. Pheko, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you so much, Ms. Makwetla.
This has been continuing, and even the latest reports of what South Africa, America's new ambassador to South Africa, the statements that he's been making. I suppose it's no surprise that it's come to this, but I think the point that one is really looking into is Washington leaning on France to rescind South Africa's G7 invite. It's reminiscent of what happened of the G20, calls for the global community to try and reach some sense in terms of speaking to Washington or preserving global trade ties and diplomatic ties. Just what are your thoughts about what really happens behind closed doors that France would agree to this?
So, the incident highlights the growing fracturing of international arrangements, the etiquette of them all, the politeness of them all, and the fact that there's certainly there seems to be a coercive atmosphere behind the scenes. It also centers the US's America First aggression as almost the default position, and really reinstills this normativity in the US's relationship to the rest of the world, very much setting them up as the pole, the constellation around which every other planet in the global order seems to revolve, which is extremely problematic. It also shows that even though they might not be overt commands or demands, it's hard to say. There certainly seems to be implicit pressure. There certainly seems to be the promise of implied consequence or the implication of consequences. And there certainly seems to be the threat of disruption, whether that's a boycott or whether that's some more trade and tariff wars, whether that's some kind of social political sanction of some kind. So this is how power seems to be working right now, not through per se formal orders or formal persuasion, but rather through making alternatives much too costly. So we see the US on a dual track. So you see a very aggressive approach, say, in the case of Nicolas Maduro, what's happening now in Cuba. And then you also see what seems to be a slightly more sinister, quiet implication of boycott or of being excluded from the big boys and girls club.
And speaking of big boys and girls club, America has never made it a secret that it considers itself the superpower, therefore the leader of the group, so to speak. But more importantly, was it a result of cosmetic change? The fact that South Africa was even part of the G7 to begin with, that this is hierarchy really exerting its power and influence, that it would have come to this at some point?
Maybe it would have, Tsepiso, because remember that the Group of Seven has increasingly functioned more as a coordination mechanism for like-minded powers. Countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa have been invited at the pleasure of these other dominating founding members, and that was really more of a concession to the fact that the world is that there is a semblance of multipolarity, that the world has moved quite significantly since the formation of the G7, but also I think in a more cynical sense, a recognition that it's almost impossible to ignore Black and brown people in this world, and attempt to also try to ensure and assure themselves of some kind of economic interest, access to resources, access to different trade agreements, and so forth. And these being three extremely important and influential countries across the respective regions. I think the other thing is that though the inclusion, let's not forget, has always been conditional, it has always been politically motivated, and sometimes just quite instrumental and rather transactional.
And just latching on to the word instrumental, South Africa wasn't just excluded, it was replaced, and with Kenya. And looking at the moves that Kenya has made politically and cozying up to the United States, the things that President William Ruto has done, which she's been criticized as being permissive to America's whims. Is this a strategic substitution, or is this just plain and simple telling South Africa that you are replaceable, know your place?
Not that important. So I think the fact that they had to find some sort of a super sub is interesting in and of itself. So it could be evidence of a couple of things, that it's not just about regional rebalancing, but that it indicates a preference for alignment over the sort of political independence that South Africa often shows at moments of great that are important. It could also signal that they're selecting a partner who is much less likely to challenge the agenda. And as you rightly say, President Ruto, who has a litany of his own domestic woes, the insurrections and the resistances of the Gen X over the last year and a half in Kenya as well, have signaled that he himself is on the back foot in many respects. He has been leaning increasingly towards naked authoritarianism, and certainly a model of governance which is problematic, to say the least. And I think it's fair to say that perhaps Kenya at the moment is viewed as more compatible to the idea of a more compliant African voice and African representative.
And then there is South Africa's domestic policy that's constantly being raised. And I was quite intrigued looking at the reactions on X, particularly from white South Africans, pointing to President Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership, throwing in racism in there, the usual ANC pot kettle lid, etc., into the mix. The question is whether transformation agendas are now being read externally as markers of alignment in a polarized world.
So, I mean, remember when we think around things like land policy, that's been one of the big thorns in the side of neoliberal Western powers who are resistant to the idea of African sovereignty. Our BRICS alignment, which has also come under some scrutiny, and remember the ultimatum, more or less implicit, in fact quite explicit, that was laid out for us at some stage that it's either BRICS or the US, really strong armed tactics, no diplomacy whatsoever. And of course, our positions on Israel, Palestine, and now Iran as well. Our historical relationship also with Cuba, our historical relationships with Nicaragua, Venezuela, and so forth. So this, as you say, this is not only seen as, these are not seen as merely domestic issues, but they are playing themselves out in the international terrain. Recently, the putrid remarks made by the incoming ambassador to South Africa about BEE and so forth, about some of the songs, the struggle songs that have been sung, which in his mind point to the veracity of some kind of a white genocide. And I think even President Trump and any sane-minded person are fully aware that there is no genocide. But what has been interesting is the narrative power that it garnered in order to distract the world and from really much more important issues. The other thing is that creates a situation and a binary where internal autonomous situations and internal transformative decisions that are really within our remit to make are then externally politicized and weaponized.
All right. Hold the thought, Ms. because I want to continue along that train of thought, non-alignment, straddling multiple power centers. Just a quick break and we'll be back with you in just a moment.
Franschhoek, get ready. The vibe is happening this March. The Monroe Jazz Festival Franschhoek is bringing more than 30 local and international acts for one unforgettable weekend, including DJ Zinhle, DJ Kent, DJ Kent Zero, Layla Hathaway, Robert Glasper, and Bilal, plus many more. From 27 to 29 March 2026, experience the music, the culture, and the energy. Grab your tickets now at ticketmaster.co.za. Montreux Jazz Festival Franschhoek. Feel the energy. Live the moment.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
In conversation with Dr. Lebohang Pheko, political economist, regarding news that South Africa has been uninvited from the G7 meeting by France as a result of reported pressure from the United States. Before we took that quick break, Dr. Pheko, you were talking about political autonomy, and I want to ask the question. There's some who are suggesting that perhaps Pretoria overestimated the space for strategic non-alignment. Others are saying that there is shrinking room for diplomatic ambiguity. Is it really diplomatic ambiguity or multiple power centers, or simply, as you say, countries exercising their international rights to set domestic policy?
Well, it depends which countries. So if we're talking about countries of the minority world, Europe, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, of course, that's a whole different kettle of fish because of the power dynamics. And of course, non-alignment has always been very important, particularly to non-European, non-Western countries, as it were, particularly because we didn't want to get caught up in wars that had nothing to do with us. We didn't want to be caught up in proxy battles coming out of the traditions of first post-colonialism and liberation struggles and the Cold War. That was one of the great poles of around which the non-alignment movement, non-alignment was even developed. And the new global order and the kind of international relations that people, especially African scholars and Asian scholars in the early 1970s were trying to think around in very creative ways. So really, what I think is happening right now is that the system is becoming much less tolerant of that sort of autonomy and that kind of ambiguity. And when I say the system as set and the system as conceptualized in the image of United States-centric power, in the image of a system where the United States is a center of consideration of economic, military, political, security power, and increasingly all other forms, other, cultural power and so forth. Non-alignment worked very well in a bipolar world during the Cold War, where we could avoid being on either side of these strange battles, which really had nothing to do with us. But now it seems that the lines have become much, much harder. Expectations of overt coerciveness have become much, much clearer. And the penalties, even though they might be slightly more subtle than the extrajudicial killings we saw a generation ago, e.g., President Saddam Hussein, e.g., Colonel Gaddafi, e.g., Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Maurice Bishop, and so forth, and maybe to some extent the removal of somebody like Nicolas Maduro begins to signal to that kind of a return to that kind of crassness. But certainly the penalties have been subtle over the last 5 to 10 years, but still tangible. And what we're seeing now is a complete, I think, a denuding of any illusion of multipolarity, and I think an attempt to reassert unipolarity, which is something I don't think we have seen in a long time, with the US trying very hard to assert itself. Fortunately, for what it's worth, we do have strong poles like China, like Russia, and we also have other strong poles, like, for example, the so-called the middle countries, as coined by the Prime Minister of Canada, including Canada itself, right? Including countries like Turkey, including countries like Brazil, for example, like India. And I would actually posit that a country like South Africa would potentially, if we had a lot more diplomatic courage, and I think the ability to if we're able to harness our own sovereignty, could also be one of those influential powers to then begin to resist this ascendance of what seems to be a unipolar, completely imperial universe.
Thank you so much, as always, for your time and insight. Senior political economist at the Trade Collective, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, weighing in on South Africa being uninvited from the G7 summit in June.
Across Africa, communities rise with the promise of clean water and clean sanitation. The African Union's 2026 theme calls us to action.
It's about mobilizing real commitments, securing climate-resilient water and sanitation projects, and ensuring that water becomes a driver of sustainable development and prosperity across the continent.
A landmark moment, not only for Africa, but for the global movement for access to safe water for all.
Assuring sustainable water availability for every home, every village, every nation. This is the Africa we want.
Channel Africa, the African perspective.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet. Channel 628. 1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
As the conflict in the Middle East continues to escalate, the world is facing what the International Energy Agency is calling the largest supply disruption in history. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed and global oil prices swinging wildly around the $100 US mark, the focus has now shifted from the battlefield to the massive underground caverns and tanks that hold the world's emergency fuel. Tapping into these reserves is no longer what if. It is happening now. To help us navigate the strategic chessboard of global oil stocks and what's expected to happen, we're going now to Professor Mark Swilling, co-director of the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University and a leading expert on resource politics. A very good evening to you, Professor Swilling. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening.
So, with the International Energy Agency warning about this, what it calls the largest supply disruption in history, I'm just wondering, at what point does this stop being a market shock and become a systemic economic crisis?
I think we're on the brink of that systemic economic crisis. I mean, if you look at the fact that the world consumes about 100 million barrels of oil per day, and the International Energy Agency has released 400 million barrels of oil, that's only 4 days' supply. And that's 25% of global reserves held by government.
And just in terms of who holds the largest oil reserves, we've seen the United States suggest that China holds the largest emergency reserves globally at roughly 1.3 billion barrels. Who does, and how important is it who does?
Well, the top the countries with the highest reserves is the USA, China, which holds more than that, more than the USA, Japan, South Korea, and India but what you need to understand is that there are two sets of reserves. There's the reserves that government holds, about 1.8 billion, and there's another 4 to 4.5 billion barrels held within the oil industry as a whole. And so the biggest reserves are actually held by oil companies.
So if wealthy nations tap into their reserves, countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, they're already facing fuel rationing or 4-day work weeks. In fact, I think I've seen the Philippines declaring international disaster. I mean, a national disaster as a result of what is happening with the Strait of Hormuz. What happens for countries like South Africa who are dependent for some of their reserves from countries like Nigeria, who is rumored to possibly be looking to sell those to the United States?
Well, I mean, quite a number of countries have got to dangerously low oil reserves and are introducing drastic measures, essentially forcing public facilities like universities to stop using energy. In the South African context, we had a very serious incident back in 2015 where our oil reserves were sold under very suspicious circumstances, but there was a successful court case to get those reserves back, which was the court ruled in favor, but we didn't get all the oil back. So we went from about 10 million barrels to almost nothing. And then gradually over time, we've been building it up until about 2022 when we started selling when prices hit $100, and we're down to maybe around 7, but we have capacity for storing up to 45 million barrels. So we don't have a big reserve left, but there has been a report that Iran let through a ship heading towards South Africa with oil. So our international positioning might be in our favor.
And just how dangerously low are we? Are we going to see incidents of supply disruption? Because the other day I just wondered, I had gone to a fuel station and they said they didn't have the particular brand of fuel that I use, and I wondered and I know there was a time in the past where you'd have to queue at several petrol stations to get oil. Are we anywhere near that? Supply disruption, is that something that we're looking at?
I don't think we're looking at serious supply disruption in the near future. As I said, our international positioning may well count in our favor, and we do have alternative sources of supply, like, as you suggested, Nigeria and other countries. But we are very dependent on oil from the Middle East. And if it is possible to negotiate the kinds of arrangements that allow ships headed towards South Africa to carry oil, then we're not in major danger. But if a much more serious conflagration takes place in the Middle East, for example, if the US starts bombing major oil installations, or the Israelis start bombing major oil installations in Iran, and Iran reacts by bombing other countries' oil infrastructures, then the whole world, including us, is going to face a very, as the IEA said, the most serious oil disruption in modern history.
And we've seen continents like Asia already experiencing shortages from petrochemicals to basic consumer goods. So is this less of an oil crisis or more of a full spectrum industrial supply chain crisis?
It's definitely an industrial supply chain crisis. I mean, it's not just about oil. It's also about gas, natural gas, and the key derivative of natural gas is fertilizer, and fertilizer is critical for food production. And so we're going to start seeing a disruption of the food chain. And we're also going to start seeing very serious disruptions of manufacturing value chains as the cost of energy puts an increasing number of businesses out of business. So it's definitely not just an oil shock. And also, what we need to bear in mind is that oil has traditionally been sold in dollars, especially from Middle East countries, on the understanding that those dollars get reinvested in the US economy. Iran was starting to move away from trading oil in US dollars, and that was a major threat to the US. And the Chinese are promoting international trade in Chinese currency. So what we might be seeing is the beginnings of global de-dollarization, which will fundamentally upset the global financial markets.
And actually, that leads into my next question on, is it a matter of how much longer this continues, that, and if it will have an impact on global trade, maritime law, or even monetary policy in countries as a result of what is happening now? And some have even accused Iran of weaponization of geography. Is it really that, or is it just the cost of war?
I definitely don't think we can blame Iran for weaponizing geography, or you can't really blame Iran for retaliating against an unprovoked attack on its sovereignty. So what we have is a US-backed Israeli bid to regionalize the Zionist power that has been a source of destabilization in the Middle East for decades. This is going to continue until there is a fundamental reset, which brings the US and Israel under control, or it's going to result in a much, much wider conflagration that will be destabilizing of the global economy much more seriously than we've seen up until now, including the destabilization of global monetary and financial systems as a result of the de-dollarization of oil trading.
Now, I want to just look at just international policy, just the Strait of Hormuz, where it sits, the issue around strategic reserves and what happens if disruption drags. But You know, what does it mean for emerging economies in particular? But also, was there a lack of thinking just in terms of checkpoints, choke points rather, when the configuration of oil supply became what it is now?
Well, there's a number of choke points in the global geography, and the countries that control those choke points charge ships passing through those choke points large amounts of money. Iran did not charge for ships going through the Strait of Hormuz. They made it available for international trade to run smoothly. So the US and Israel attacked Iran on the assumption that it would be a short and decisive victory after killing the leadership, and then things would return to normal when a compliant Iranian government was put in place. That hasn't materialized. And as a result of the assumption that this was going to be a short and quick attack resulting in regime change, no measures were taken to protect the Straits of Hormuz for ships passing through. And so we have the situation that we have now. We are into a war, a conflagration that could be prolonged, become a quagmire, and become regionalized. And eventually, as Jeffrey Sachs from the US has been arguing, could possibly trigger World War III. So I think we're in a very, very serious situation, and it's not just about the Strait of Hormuz. It's a much greater threat to the destruction of the biggest oil infrastructures, but also the massive civilian casualties that go along with that, which are completely unnecessary.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Much appreciated your time and your insights. Professor Mark Swilling, co-director of the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University and a leading expert on resource politics, just sharing his thoughts about what is happening now in terms of global fuel supply and what the result will be, not only for developing countries, but just in terms of the global supply chain availability.
Across Africa, communities rise with the promise of clean water and clean sanitation. The African Union's 2026 theme calls us to action.
It's about mobilizing real commitments, securing climate-resilient water and sanitation projects, and ensuring that water becomes a driver of sustainable development and prosperity across the continent.
A landmark moment, not only for Africa, but for the global movement for access to safe water for all.
Assuring sustainable water availability for every home, every village, every nation. This is the Africa we want.
Channel Africa, the African perspective.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
It is now 17 minutes to 10. The UN General Assembly has adopted a draft resolution that unequivocally condemns the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the transatlantic slave trade as the most inhumane and enduring injustice against humanity. The resolution also seeks to recognize the profound and lasting impacts of the abhorrent regimes of slavery and colonialism, and emphasizes that claims for reparations represent a concrete step towards remedying historical wrongs against Africans and the people of African descent. Sharon Bryce-Pease reports on how the vote unfolded and some of the objections raised.
123 countries in favour, 52 abstentions and 3 voting against: the USA, Israel and Argentina. The initiative was spearheaded by Ghana and the Africa Group that earlier explained the draft resolution was the result of a clear continental mandate taken at the highest levels of the African Union. Listen to Ghana's President John Mahama.
This current draft resolution is a result of months of consultation and consensus building by continental bodies, nations, experts, scholars, and jurists, with the sole aim of achieving a united front and grounding the final outcome in truth, compassion, and moral conscience, remembrance, education, and dialogue. So today we come together in solemn solidarity to affirm truth and pursue a route to healing and reparative justice. The adoption of this resolution serves as a safeguard against forgetting. It also challenges the enduring scars of slavery. And so delegates, on this beautiful day in March, were called to stand on the right side of history. Let it be recorded that when history beckoned, we did what was right.
The resolution unequivocally condemns the trafficking of enslaved Africans as the most inhumane and enduring injustice against humanity. It emphasizes that claims for reparations represent a concrete step towards remedying historical wrongs against African people. It calls on member states to engage in good faith dialogue on reparatory justice, including a full and formal apology, the prompt restitution of cultural properties, artifacts and archives, and requests the Secretary-General to produce a report on implementation during the GA's 82nd session, which begins in September next year. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
The wounds run deep and often go unrecognized. I've often said the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity that struck at the core of personhood, broke up families, and devastated communities. To justify the unjustifiable, slavery's proponents and beneficiaries constructed a racist ideology, turning prejudice into a pseudoscience. This perverse global order thrived because power acted without conscience, and we must use our power for better ends. By reflecting the false narrative of racial hierarchy and calling out the ugly lie of white supremacy.
Several delegations, including the United States, could not support the text. U.S. Representative Ambassador Dan Negria.
While we acknowledge the horrors of the past, we do not accept this resolution's assertion that historical facts from the 15th through 19th century constitute violations of jus cogens, as the term is understood in contemporary international law. The United States also does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. In addition to its obvious legal problems, this resolution is also unclear as to who the recipients of reparatory justice would be.
Some countries also objected to what they viewed as an effort to rank crimes against humanity, pushing back at the notion that some atrocity crimes were less severe than others. Ghana's Foreign Minister Samuel Ablakwa rejected that view in the Assembly, arguing that the resolution established a principal framework for reconciliation grounded in truth and that it reflected the broadest possible views of member states. The non-binding text, while not adopted unanimously due to several legal and technical objections from European and other Western states, still passed on the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which is March 25th. I'm Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York.
To speak about the security, political and international implications of this global reckoning, we're joined by Dr. Victor Doke, a prominent security analyst and lecturer at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I mean, when we talk about slavery, it's often framed as a moral issue. And I'm just wondering to what extent this particular development will be successful in it being a political instrument to reshape global historical narratives.
I think at this point in time, when we're looking at the aspect of moving from bipolar to multipolar world order, where we are giving power to and equal rights to every state, it is in the right direction that Africa and mostly those that were affected by this kind of inhumane, event would lead the course for recognition that this was a very, inhumane, unfortunate incident that has happened. Collectively, we are looking at how the global governance space is recognizing Africa as a major global player, and hence giving us that opportunity to express our needs to be recognized, that this particular incident has to be condemned in whatever form, in whatever shape. And hence this process, the voting pattern, and then Africa collectively agreeing that this is what we need to understand for the global, stage to recognize us and to give us that recognition that we are a major global player, and hence we need this to be recognized and condemned, on certain terms. However, when we're looking at the aspect of some countries not agreeing to the fact that reparations, are a call that some African states are heeding or leading, it brings to the question of whether we are actually collectively looking at global governance in the sense of multilateralism. There is a lot of issues with regards to how countries view, the transatlantic slave trade as. Some, per what we've seen, those who didn't vote, are disagreeing on technicalities, wording, or whatever, that we need to understand holistically. What exactly are they looking at against what we're looking at? So I think in all, this offers an opportunity for us collectively to now meet and then decide the way forward regards to what terms, what exactly, whether material or tangible or intangible reparations are we looking for.
I think for me, what really stood out for me were countries like the United States and Israel were effectively asking if this really was slavery by saying that they're objecting on the basis of, and is it really a technicality when they say, well, I mean, why are we being asked to reject something that was legal at the time? No wrongdoing was done.
Well, when you're looking at the power dynamics also in this situation, because there are a lot of dynamics that are playing out. Now, you don't expect that those countries that hold veto, okay, the USA, would agree to, the process or technicalities involved with regards to the discussion as at this point. It will not put them in the right, position, looking at their position on a global stage. Now, when you talk about Israel, of recent, we know how, issues with regards to conflict, and then the aspect of African states coming out clearly, to sort of like critique the actions of Israel. This dynamics in the global stage has what resulted in these two countries coming out with regards to rejecting the terminologies or the concept of reparation in a totality. Now, whether it would take them to now critically look at the excesses, what happened, and then what other countries are going to do now will determine whether they will have a change of mind or not. But holistically, for them, of course, this is a resolution. So they are not sort of bound by it to accept it. It is very much respected. But then this also calls for us to look at whether we are going to be divided henceforth going forward, because you're talking about the USA being a veto, and we know the power that they hold with regards to decision making on the global stage. So do we need other major global players to back us up to be able to go further than this resolution That is the big question we need to answer.
And
now.
let me just step in on that exactly, because I mean, I see calls for reparatory justice, and it seems like, and not to be pessimistic, that we will be beating this drum for a very long time, because there are countries who are saying, yes, we see the wrong, but why are we talking about reparations? South Africans will tell you, and I'm sure you know this, that we face this all the time when we talk about what happened during the apartheid era. We always have to be put in our place or apologize for something that so-called happened a long time ago. So what I'm looking at now is the epistemic authority over this issue, because the argument over this is that it's beyond apologies, it's beyond restitution, it's about the reality that Africans are still facing the effects of a slavery in this day and age. Is it something that we really need a commitment on, or hope to expect, or is there a way that Africa can just accept that in the deal makings, or however we govern, that we extract that?
Well, you've said one important thing, whether it will be, yes, long term. That's the way I also see it. And what actually are we looking for here with regards to, whether the tangibles or intangibles? Are we looking for reparations in the form of what? Financial, restitution, restitution itself? Are we looking at areas materially connected with regards to technology, or what exactly is it? The message itself isn't clear with regards to what we want. Or we are looking for just, Memorial Day, a monument, something put together, or, some sort of like bigger celebration than what we had, quite recently. Now, the discussion will continue. And then you will take that collective action again, as it did, where, we have regional organizations here on the continent, such as the AU, supporting the cause. Now, as to whether going forward, we are going to stick together and then also table our demands in the context of the specific reparation we want is another question. Are some countries going to fall off due to pressure from those who rejected, or those superpowers, or not? In this particular time is where we are going to see whether we ourselves who are asking for reparations are together or not.
And because that's the thing, because it may force us into a position, as you say, where geopolitical convenience is more palatable for some countries over others. I mean, the insulting things that were said, like perhaps we're looking for an additional international day. I mean, I know it's absolute ignorance that it would inform a statement like that. But the thing is, when we say we're claiming some of these colonial spaces, like we have memorials in London, for instance, that are central to the empire that exacted this injustice, how important is it, the counter-historical narratives that we ourselves can tell our own future generations, to get it from nations that hardly see us as people, that hardly think that we are at a level that we ought to enjoy the freedoms, the economic, economic aspirations that they have, for instance?
Well, it's quite an interesting side now, because we not only looking at the historical antecedents, but the evolution 15th to 19th century, and we can talk about how the global stage, international organizations that were controlled by these global powers, and then relating it to the global governance itself and how they really position Africa, where we even considered. Now, from that time to this 21st century we are in, if global powers and translating it to the global governance system did not recognize, and whether the discussion came up and they showed it, and holistically did not come to realize that what happened was inhumane. Now, in this 21st century, where we have seen that collective might, go on that international stage for people, for countries to recognize, then there is a change in how this, global powers, international governance will now position Africa, that we are a force to reckon with. So if we stick to that momentum, when we stick to that agenda, of African multilateralism, then we can achieve something, and then make the global stage understand that those days are past. This is the new era.
All right, Dr. Doke, I'm afraid we have to end it here, and we do hope that is what happens. The momentum, the unity is maintained. Dr. Victor Doke, a prominent security analyst and lecturer at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
I wonder, should I sing the SIG tune for African Diaries? We are in the heart of African Diaries. Nevertheless, I should tell you what's coming up on the show this evening. In the first hour, we speak to serial entrepreneur, that is Sonia Booth. And we're going to be talking about Marula Cheesecake Passion, which I'm excited. One of her ventures. Things that we can do with the Marula fruit is what we're going to be looking at. And then in the second hour of the show, we look at Peak Child Poetry Movement and how they are bringing a piece titled The Growth Sessions. And this is happening from this Saturday, the 28th of March. All right, looking forward to that from us. We're out. Up next, Shayla Ndukumana.
Conversations that touch the heart and inspire change. Here on African Diaries, only on Channel Africa. Join us on www.channelafrica.co.za.